For some people, certain cities have simply become too black for comfort. When civil rights laws began dismantling legal segregation in the 1950s and 1960s, black families moved into neighborhoods that had once been almost entirely white. That shift did not happen quietly, and it did not happen without reaction. As integration increased, many white residents began relocating to suburbs, often citing concerns about property values, school quality, or safety. Over time, that movement became known as white flight, and it reshaped the economic and demographic landscape of American cities. The departure was not always loud or publicly framed as racial, but the patterns were measurable in census data, tax bases, and neighborhood boundaries. Today, we are looking at top 5 cities white people are quietly leaving, and examining what those ongoing shifts reveal about urban structure and opportunity. This is not about blaming individuals or reducing complex cities to a headline. It is about understanding how demographic movement intersects with policy, infrastructure, and long-term investment patterns. If you are thinking about relocating, ignoring those patterns can cost more than just money. Number 5, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Milwaukee rarely trends for glamour, but it consistently appears in national research on residential segregation. Using 2020 census-based measurements, Brown University's Diversity and Disparities Project ranked the Milwaukee metropolitan area among the most segregated black-white metro regions in the United States. That ranking is based on the dissimilarity index. It is a metric that estimates the percentage of one group that would need to relocate in order to achieve an even neighborhood distribution. In Milwaukee's case, the index has remained above 70 in recent measurements, which researchers classify as a very high level of segregation. An index above 60 is already considered high, so exceeding 70 places the region in a statistically extreme category. At the same time, Wisconsin as a state remains approximately 86% white according to recent census data. Within the city of Milwaukee, however, the black population represents roughly 38 to 40% of residents, creating a sharp contrast between state-level demographics and city-level concentration. That contrast matters because segregation is not about overall diversity, but about how evenly groups are distributed across neighborhoods. It's between 2010 and 2020, the white population inside the city limits declined, while several surrounding suburban counties maintained higher white population shares, reinforcing outward demographic movement. Suburban counties such as Waukesha and Ozaukee remain more than 80% white, according to census estimates. When white residents relocate from the urban core to predominantly white suburbs, the geographic redistribution of income follows them. Public school funding in many districts relies heavily on property tax revenue, meaning shifts in household income distribution can directly affect school resources. Milwaukee Public Schools has faced enrollment and funding pressures over the years, partially reflecting broader population changes. Median household income disparities between predominantly white and predominantly black census tracts in the region exceed tens of thousands of dollars annually. Homeownership rates also show measurable gaps, with white households in Wisconsin reporting significantly higher ownership percentages than black households statewide. Those ownership disparities influence wealth accumulation, neighborhood stability, and long-term investment patterns. When clusters of higher income households concentrate outside city boundaries, commercial development frequently follows suburban growth corridors. Retail density, grocery access, and infrastructure upgrades often align with those same corridors. Inside Milwaukee's historically black neighborhoods, median home values remain substantially lower than in many surrounding suburban communities. That valuation gap affects both tax revenue and generational equity. Milwaukee's segregation pattern is not an abstract theory debated online. It is visible in census tract maps that display concentrated racial clustering. Researchers have noted that the city's north side and parts of the central city contain disproportionately high percentages of black residents compared to surrounding suburbs. This distribution pattern did not emerge overnight, and it was shaped by decades of housing policy, lending practices, and suburban expansion incentives. Highway connectivity made commuting from suburban municipalities efficient, enabling residents to relocate without severing employment ties to the urban core. Over time, those outward moves reduced the fiscal base of certain neighborhoods while strengthening others. Even as redevelopment initiatives target downtown revitalization, segregation metrics indicate that residential separation remains statistically high. Milwaukee demonstrates how demographic percentages, suburban growth, and residential clustering interact to reshape economic geography. If you are evaluating relocation, the relevant question is not whether Milwaukee is diverse overall. The relevant question is how evenly opportunity is distributed across census tracts within the metropolitan region. Because when an index remains remains above 70 decades after major migration waves, it signals that white flight's structural imprint has not fully dissolved. Number 4. Los Angeles, California. Los Angeles did not collapse under industrial bankruptcy like Detroit. Yet its demographic transformation over the last 60 years has been just as structurally significant. In 1960, non-Hispanic white residents made up roughly 80% of Los Angeles County's population, according to United States Census data. By 1990, that figure had dropped below 50%, and by 2020 it declined to under 30%, representing a decrease of more than 50 percentage points across 6 decades. That change was not caused by a single event, but by sustained migration, suburban expansion, and long-term population sorting. Following World War II, federally backed mortgages and aggressive freeway construction expanded outward mobility for middle-class households. Between 1950 and 1970, Los Angeles dramatically expanded its freeway system, enabling commuters to live farther from the urban core while maintaining employment access. As central neighborhoods diversified during the 1960s and 1970s, many white households relocated to areas such as the San Fernando Valley and neighboring counties. Orange County, for example, remained more than 85% white in 1970, reinforcing a suburban contrast to increasingly diverse city districts. When even a 5% shift occurs in a county exceeding 7 million residents at the time, that represents hundreds of thousands of people redistributing geographically. That redistribution altered where property taxes accumulated and where school districts derived financial stability. Homeownership rates in suburban communities were consistently higher than in historically minority urban neighborhoods, increasing wealth accumulation gaps over time. Median household income in several surrounding counties surpassed central Los Angeles averages by thousands of dollars annually during the 1980s and 1990s. Property values in coastal and suburban enclaves often doubled those found in certain inner-city census tracts. Because school funding frequently correlates with local property tax revenue, income concentration outside the urban core influenced educational resource disparities. Meanwhile, the city of Los Angeles itself became majority Hispanic, reflecting both immigration growth and white suburban migration. By 2020, non-Hispanic white residents represented less than 1/3 of the city's total population. Los Angeles County's total population eventually exceeded 10 million, meaning demographic percentage shifts translated into massive absolute numbers. Infrastructure placement further shaped opportunity distribution, as freeway corridors often divided lower-income neighborhoods while enhancing suburban connectivity. Retail corridors and commercial development increasingly followed suburban population growth during peak expansion decades. That outward consumer migration reinforced economic concentration beyond traditional urban centers. Income inequality across Los Angeles County remains among the highest in the nation, reflecting long-term geographic sorting. Even as downtown redevelopment projects attract investment, housing affordability gaps persist across different regions of the county. Suburban municipalities that expanded rapidly in the late 20th century continue to maintain higher median home values than many central neighborhoods. White flight in Los Angeles did not resemble a sudden exodus. It unfolded gradually through housing policy, lending access, and land development incentives. From roughly 80% white in 1960 to under 30% in 2020, the demographic shift represents one of the most dramatic proportional changes among major U.S. metropolitan areas. Those numbers illustrate how infrastructure, suburban growth, and residential preference combine to redistribute wealth geographically. Los Angeles demonstrates that demographic change in the West was shaped less by factory shutdowns and more by mobility, zoning, and the economics of suburban advantage. Number 3. Washington, D.C. D.C. offers one of the clearest historical examples of white population decline, followed by long-term structural transformation. In 1950, white residents made up roughly 65% of the district's population, according to census data. By 1970, that number had fallen to approximately 28%, representing a drop of more than 30 percentage points in just 2 decades. During that same period, black residents became the majority, and by 1980, African Americans accounted for nearly 70% of the city's population. That demographic reversal did not happen quietly, and it did not happen without economic consequences. As white households relocated to suburban areas in Maryland and Virginia, population growth accelerated in counties such as Montgomery County and Fairfax County. Fairfax County's population, for example, more than doubled between 1960 and 1980 as suburban expansion intensified. When residents moved outward, purchasing power and property tax contributions moved with them. Because the district relies heavily on property and income taxes taxes to fund schools and municipal services, large-scale outward migration altered fiscal stability. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the city faced declining population totals, losing more than 100,000 residents between 1970 and 1980 alone. A shrinking population base affects housing demand, commercial investment, and long-term infrastructure maintenance. School enrollment numbers declined during key decades, influencing funding allocations and public education stability. By the 1990s, Washington, D.C. faced budget pressures severe enough to require federal financial oversight. But while white flight was not the sole cause of fiscal strain, demographic shifts played a measurable role in reshaping the city's revenue structure. Median household income disparities between the district and certain surrounding suburbs widened over time. Home ownership rates in suburban Maryland and Northern Virginia surpassed those within many D.C. neighborhoods during peak migration years. As suburban jurisdictions accumulated higher income households, retail corridors and corporate offices increasingly followed that growth. Downtown D.C. experienced cycles of decline and reinvestment, particularly in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Beginning in the 2000s, the district saw renewed population growth and significant increases in median home values. Between 2000 and 2020, the white share of the population rose modestly, while the black population percentage declined from roughly 60% to under 45%. That reversal illustrates how demographic movement can operate in multiple directions over time. Rising housing prices placed affordability pressure on long-term residents in certain neighborhoods. Median home values in parts of Northwest D.C. now exceed national averages by substantial margins, sometimes doubling figures seen 2 decades earlier. Income concentration within redevelopment zones contrasts sharply with persistent poverty rates in other wards. Ward-level disparities reveal median household income differences exceeding tens of thousands of dollars annually across the city. These differences reflect not only present-day market forces, but decades of earlier population sorting. Old Washington demonstrates that white flight reshaped the city's demographic foundation, but subsequent reinvestment introduced new forms of inequality layered on top of older ones. The decline from 65% white in 1950 to under 30% by 1970 marked one of the fastest racial composition changes among major American cities. That rapid transformation influenced tax revenue, school funding, and neighborhood stability for decades afterward. Washington, D.C. shows how demographic percentages, suburban growth, and fiscal structure interact to quietly redefine urban opportunity across generations. Number 2, Chicago, Illinois. Chicago has long been cited as one of the most segregated major cities in the United States, and that distinction is supported by measurable demographic data. But according to analyses based on 2020 census data from Brown University's Diversity and Disparities Project, Chicago ranks at or near the top among large metropolitan areas in black-white residential segregation. The white-black dissimilarity index for Chicago has historically remained above 75, a level researchers classify as extremely high. An index at that level means more than 70% of one group would need to move to achieve an even distribution across neighborhoods. In 1950, Chicago's population was approximately 87% white, reflecting a city that was far less racially diverse at mid-century. By 1980, the white share of the population had declined to roughly 57% as black migration from the South and suburban relocation patterns reshaped the urban core. Between 1970 and 1980 alone, Chicago lost more than 400,000 residents, a significant portion of whom were white households relocating to suburban Cook County and surrounding counties. Suburban counties such as DuPage and Lake maintained substantially higher white population percentages during those decades compared to the city itself. DuPage County, for example, was over 90% white in 1980 according to census figures. As white residents relocated outward, property tax contributions increasingly concentrated in suburban districts. Because Illinois relies heavily on local property taxes to fund public schools, those residential shifts influenced educational funding disparities. Chicago Public Schools has historically served a student population that is predominantly black and Hispanic. While several suburban districts maintained higher per-pupil funding levels, median household income in many northern and western suburbs has exceeded city averages by tens of thousands of dollars annually. Additionally, home ownership rates in suburban counties have also remained higher than those within Chicago's predominantly black neighborhoods. That gap in ownership rates translates into long-term wealth accumulation differences tied directly to geography. During the 1990s and early 2000s, Chicago's overall population stabilized, yet segregation levels remained persistently high. Even as downtown development expanded and high-rise construction increased near the Loop, residential separation across the broader metropolitan region showed limited change. On Chicago's South Side and West Side neighborhoods have historically recorded higher poverty rates compared to northern lakefront communities. In certain census tracts, poverty rates have exceeded 30%, while wealthier districts maintain rates in the single digits. The racial composition of those neighborhoods often aligns with those economic divides. Between 2000 and 2020, Chicago's total population declined by nearly 200,000 residents, and white population losses continued in some parts of the city even as suburban counties grew. Meanwhile, several suburban municipalities saw consistent growth in assessed property values over the same period. Income concentration outside the urban core strengthened suburban fiscal stability, while parts of the city managed declining enrollment and budget pressures. Retail corridors and commercial expansion followed suburban population growth patterns, reinforcing economic redistribution. Although Chicago remains one of the nation's largest cities, the proportion of non-Hispanic white residents within city limits fell to roughly 33% by 2020. That represents a dramatic shift from the 87% recorded 70 years earlier. White flight in Chicago was not a single-year event, but a sustained pattern of suburban relocation stretching across multiple decades. The cumulative effect of that movement reshaped neighborhood boundaries, school funding structures, and commercial investment flows. Even today, Chicago's segregation index indicates that residential separation remains deeply embedded in the metropolitan landscape. Chicago demonstrates how demographic percentages, suburban growth, and property tax structures can quietly reinforce separation long after the initial migration waves slow down. Number 1. Detroit, Michigan. Detroit stands as one of the most frequently cited examples of how long-term population shifts can permanently alter a city's economic foundation. In 1950, Detroit had a population of approximately 1.85 million residents, making it the fourth largest city in the United States at the time. During that year, white residents made up roughly 83% of the city's population according to census data. By 1980, the total population had fallen to about 1.2 million, representing a loss of more than 600,000 residents in 3 decades. During that same period, the white share of the population declined dramatically as suburban relocation accelerated. By 1990, Detroit's white population had dropped below 20%, marking a profound demographic reversal from mid-century levels. Meanwhile, suburban counties surrounding Detroit, including Oakland and Macomb counties, experienced population growth during key decades of urban decline. Oakland County's population increased from roughly 396,000 in 1950 to more than 1 million by 1990. That outward redistribution represented hundreds of thousands of households relocating beyond city boundaries. When residents leave a city in such large numbers, municipal revenue contracts accordingly. Property tax collections depend directly on occupied housing and stable property values. Between 1950 and 2010, Detroit lost more than 1 million residents, shrinking to roughly 713,000 people by 2010. That represents a population decline of over 60% from its peak. Vacancy rates increased significantly as households relocated, leaving thousands of properties unoccupied. By the late 2000s, some estimates indicated that tens of thousands of housing units sat vacant across the city. Lower occupancy reduces assessed property values, which in turn decreases taxable revenue available for public services. Manufacturing employment also declined sharply as auto industry restructuring accelerated in the late 20th century. From 1947 to 2010, Detroit lost a substantial portion of its manufacturing base, weakening the employment pipeline that had originally fueled population growth. Median household income within Detroit fell below suburban averages by wide margins during peak decline decades. By the early 2000s, poverty rates within the city exceeded 30%, reflecting deep economic distress. Suburban counties, by contrast, maintained higher median income levels and stronger home ownership rates. Because Michigan relies heavily on property and income taxes for local government funding, those suburban gains strengthened fiscal stability outside city limits. In 2013, Detroit filed for Chapter 9 bankruptcy protection, with reported debts exceeding $18 billion at the time of filing. That bankruptcy bankruptcy became widely described as the largest municipal bankruptcy in United States history. The filing reflected decades of declining revenue, rising service costs, and shrinking population density. Street lighting, police staffing, and public school funding all faced strain as fiscal pressures mounted. By 2020, Detroit's population remained under 700,000 residents, less than half its mid-century peak. Although certain downtown districts have experienced redevelopment, many neighborhoods continue to show visible gaps in reinvestment. Median home values in some areas remain substantially lower than suburban counterparts located only miles away. Detroit's demographic shift from over 80% white in 1950 to a predominantly black city within a generation illustrates how rapidly racial composition can change. The long-term decline of more than 1 million residents demonstrates how sustained outward movement reshapes tax bases and economic stability. Detroit shows that when white flight intersects with industrial contraction and suburban expansion, the structural consequences can persist for generations. And the patterns we explored across these 5 cities show how demographic shifts can reshape entire regions over time. White flight may be rooted in mid-20th century history, but its structural effects still influence housing markets, school funding, and neighborhood stability today. When population percentages change, tax bases and public investment priorities often change with them. Those shifts are measurable in census data, property values, and income distribution. This conversation is not about blame, but about understanding long-term economic consequences. If you are thinking about relocating, study more than surface level affordability or downtown development. Examine where opportunity is concentrated and how evenly it is distributed across neighborhoods. Awareness is a strategy, not a controversy. Why? If this breakdown gave you insight, hit the like button so more people can see the data behind the headlines. Subscribe for deeper urban analysis and share your perspective in the comments below.